Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Bruce Bennett. Bruce is a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation, and today we're going to be speaking about one of his recent articles called Preparing North Korean Elites for Unification. Now, quite inexplicably, this seems to be one of the forgotten aspects of Korean unification. Through all the rosy-eyed discussions and through all the risk assessment, what is often forgotten through all this is just how the North Korean elite will respond. And of course, they are the important element in this. Without them, it doesn't happen. Now, normally I would do a longer introduction about the podcast itself, but I need to do a brief introduction here. Because due to a minor technical difficulty, the first 4 minutes of this podcast is missing. So I'm going to fill in for you what Bruce spoke about. It's not much. It's just an introduction, a setting of the scene. So I will try and do that now for you. It won't be as good as what Bruce did, but I'll try and fill in the gaps for you here. Now, the important element here is just who the North Korean elite are, who we're going to be speaking about throughout this discussion. North Korea is still governed by a particularly deep political caste system called Sonbun, whereby all adult North Koreans are defined into 3 separate groups: the core group, the wavering group, and the hostile group. Now, below these are 51 separate subclasses. And for the purpose of this discussion, of course, we're speaking about the core group. Now, this makes up about 25 to 30% of the Korean population. Now, that's quite large, of course. But inside that is a much smaller group, perhaps only several thousand people in total. And at different points throughout this podcast, we will bounce back between these two groups. There is a difference between the higher echelons of the North Korean regime and the broader elite that surrounds society itself. Following that, we need to have a quick look at just what the conditions inside North Korea are today. This is still effectively a planned economy, but since the famine in the 1990s, the North Korean economy has never really functioned this way. Increasingly, more and more people are feeding themselves, creating wealth, and moving up in society through the free market and entrepreneurialism. Along the way, they are paying bribes, they are receiving bribes. It is a mess. There is nothing ideal about this scenario, but it is increasingly free, it is increasingly open. The state no longer controls every aspect of its citizens' economic lives. Having touched on this, we can now pick up with Bruce doing a much better job at this than me. And with a question, with this foundation in mind, just what North Korean elites actually want, what they will need for reunification to work, and what they'll need South Korea to offer them if they are in any way going to entertain this sort of change in their lives. So without me offering anything more, Bruce Bennett will open up this discussion about the prospect of a Korean unification. And of course, the real challenges, the real problems, and the real key issue in everything, which is the North Korean elite. The link to the article that we are discussing today will be attached below this podcast, and the article is entitled Preparing North Korean Elites for Unification. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you consider it in any way valuable, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Bruce Bennett. Alright, so what we might do now is push into some of these core objectives. So a big chunk of your piece here is just what these people will actually want when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of it all. So an important factor, a very important factor in all of this stuff is in fact individual safety and security. Many of these North Korean elites will quite naturally be quite scared about what is actually going to happen to them in a unified country.
Well, that's right. If the country is unified under South Korean control, which is normally what the South Koreans anticipate, then the North Koreans are afraid almost all of the government officials have taken bribes, because the salary for a government official in North Korea is about enough to buy half a kilogram of rice per month. That's it. So they would starve if they didn't take bribes. Bribery is a major part of the system. You probably got most of the core class have been involved in it to some extent or another. And they are afraid that when South Korea gets control, if they do, that they will be taken to court, they will be thrown in prison, and many of them will be executed because they've done more than just bribery. They've done human rights abuses and other things that would cause them to be subject to severe punishment. But at very least, they expect that the South Koreans will kick anybody from the Korean Workers' Party, essentially your Communist Party, out of the government. They'll no longer have a job or a position. And that could be a death sentence as well, because no one's going to want to hire them. How are they going to eat? How are they going to live? So either the legal system or the economic system is bound to catch them and cause them great damage.
And for people out there wondering why the concept of bribery might be such a concerning specter for them, if you look back in South Korean history itself, their recent presidents, in fact, you have Park Geun-hye, who's now been impeached and is now in prison. Lee Moon-bak is up on charges at the moment of bribery and corruption. And the two people previously, or not previously, but two previous presidents, Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, were both also imprisoned, at least in part, on bribery charges.
Well, in fact, the president before Lee Myung-bak, president from 2003 to 2008, he was up on charges of bribery and other crimes, and he committed suicide. This was after he left the presidency. So this has been a part of the culture, but in North Korea it's far, far worse, because in the North Korean system, being a merchant, doing any kind of marketing, is against the law. They aren't supposed to do that. Everything's supposed to go into the public distribution system, but not a whole lot anymore does, only what's in compelled. And as a result, for those who are doing marketing and making money and trying to have a better life, they have to bribe the security officials or they will be thrown in prison. So this is the kind of case it is. If you want a good place to live, you've got to bribe in order to get it. It's a standard part of life, in part because the government personnel aren't paid a livable wage.
So at least part of this is an important thing and it's quite an unpleasant thing to actually think about, but South Koreans are going to have to start imagining and drawing up plans for amnesty, at least for a very large amount of the North Korean core. So you mentioned there that this should exclude serious human rights abuses. But imagine that this amnesty net would catch most of the North Korean elite.
Sure. Well, if you think about it, South Korea has, roughly speaking, about 50,000 prison spaces. Those are full today. So South Korea would have a choice. If I've got maybe 3 to 5 million North Koreans who've been involved in bribery that I can likely prove, am I going to try and put all of them in prison? And if so, where am I going to detain them until I can do the court on them? The South Korean judicial system is designed so that they support a few thousand criminal cases each year. They're not designed to do hundreds of thousands. So these people could get stuck either just some kind of informal criminal treatment that probably violates the South Korean Constitution, or they've got to have amnesty. And in the end, the people who have been the elites in North Korea, while some of them have committed real crimes, many of them are now the capitalists of North Korea. They're the ones who are making the economy work. If you throw all of them into prison, then those people won't make the new North Korea part of combined Korea. It won't work economically. You can't get rid of those people. You've got to keep them at least through a significant transition period, and most likely those are the entrepreneurs that you will be able to base an expanding economy in North Korea. So this is an issue both of judicial import but also economic import. What you conclude is there are some people who've been guilty of very serious human rights violations, especially the guards at the political prison camps. They've beaten people, killed people, raped people on a regular basis. Those people definitely still need to have court hearings. Some of the leadership over them likely also do, too. But the person who's been involved in paying a bribe so that he can take his wheat to market or his rice to market probably ought to be given amnesty, because it was just the way the North Korean system worked.
And you just touched on something there important there about a second point here, and it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about Iraq and the de-Baathification of Iraqi society after the war there, that it is important to keep at least highly skilled people, highly technical people in positions of power after this collapse. So just talk us through how important it's going to be to keep North Korean elites inside their actual positions itself, regardless of transitional justice.
Well, the natural tendency, I think, in a unification will be to say, all the people who've been in the hostile class, we've got to make them bureaucrats and so forth because they've been mistreated and they now need to have opportunities. The problem is those people know nothing about running an electrical system, running a water system, keeping buildings operating. They've never been given that chance. They've never had that chance for that kind of employment. So unless you keep the people who are technocrats, who are very familiar with how a government works, you could go through a period like Iraq did of 10 years or so when things just don't work. And that's a disaster, because if things don't work, the North Koreans more broadly, across classes, are going to become very dissatisfied with the unification and probably rebel against it. So you've got to create a system that works where the economy is expanding, people are making a reasonable salary, getting goods and services. Now, they won't be up to the South Korean standard, but they'll be far better than what they've known in the past. And that's got to happen, or you're going to have very dissatisfied people who aren't going to take it for years and years before they rebel.
So you've just touched on something there that I don't hear much treatment of inside the media, that when we speak about reunification, there is a very real risk here of this not just it becoming a nice, neat German-style unification, which really wasn't that neat after all, but a deeply held, ingrained insurgency, in effect, another Iraq.
Right, exactly. So the East German military was about 180,000 military personnel before the unification. Actually, right before the unification, they'd fallen to about 120,000. And of the 180,000, many of them were actually employed in industry in East Germany. So day to day, they worked in industry, even though they technically were in uniform or supposed to be. By the time you were 2 or 3 years out from unification, only 3% of those people were still in the military. So that was a significant transition, but there were jobs, they were able to employ them. North Korea has a military somewhere around 1.2 million people, another probably 400,000 to 500,000 in security services who are drafted just like the military people, and many of them are armed like the military people, at least with small arms. And so you've got a very large number of people with military training. There are supposed to be some 200,000 special forces, plus probably another 100 or 1,000 or so in the security services who have special forces like training to be the real hard security services people. And you put those together and you say, if those people really don't like what's happening, they could cause substantial problem. And that will start with the senior officers who will feel like they are being kicked out of a place where they have every right to be. And they will try to organize around themselves rebellion. And that could become very difficult to handle. And here's the gotcha. The South Koreans have a horrendous demographics. They're getting 1.2 births per woman per lifetime. That means their military, the ROK Army, the South Korean Army, has gone from 560,000 roughly 10 to 15 years ago. It's now down around 480,000. But in another 4 years, it is scheduled to go down more than another 100,000 to about 365. And it will go down to roughly 300,000 before you hit the bottom of the trough in roughly 2026. 300,000 man army is not going to impose control and stability in North Korea if you get any kind of pushback from the North Koreans.
And I suppose another important element in this that often goes by the wayside here is that North Korea is a military-first society. So it has built itself up on an idea that there's an aggressive world, particularly America, and that we are the last defenders of this. And this is why so much hardship inside the country is tolerated, because we're putting so much money towards our military. And as much as nice as it is to imagine that they're not really believing this, it's hard to imagine that this isn't seeping deep into the minds of most of the military establishment. So the idea that they can simply lay down their arms and accept early retirement is not going to be a pleasant thing for them.
It wasn't a pleasant thing in East Germany, actually, but fortunately, people had this strong belief in East Germany that things would get better once unification occurs. That's not a belief that the North Koreans have. And certainly, if you turn to them and want them to put down their arms and give up their jobs, there aren't going to be jobs for them unless some kind of program is set up to keep them employed. What I've recommended is for the military that you're going to cut loose, you probably have to have something like we did during the Great Depression in the United States. During that period, we created what we called the Civilian Conservation Corps. We took lots of young men, which is what you would have as draftees in the North Korean military, and put them into camps that built dams and roads and other infrastructure in the United States. All of that infrastructure is needed in North Korea badly. North Korea has, according to the CIA World Factbook, has less than 1,000 kilometers of paved roads out of 27,000. There's huge amounts that could be done by an organized infrastructure development group. But that has to be arranged, paid for, resourced, equipment organized to support them so that they could do that.
So on that point there of money itself, another point that you bring up here is the place of North Korean elites and their acquired wealth over the years. So what do you do about this money that they have acquired? I mean, often illegally, of course, as you mentioned, this is a public distribution system. They're not meant to have private wealth, but they have amassed over the years a huge amount of money. And of course, their attachment to this is shown quite strongly by the 2009 attempted currency reform, where the North Korean higher elite tried to impose certain currency restrictions, and they're effectively pushed back by resistance from their own people.
Yeah. So when you look at essentially the rich in North Korea, you've got two categories. One category is those who are rich because they were in the core class, they had the opportunity, they took it. I'm told that many of the elites during this famine in the 1995 to 98 timeframe were very closely watching the hostile class. When they watched them, they were trying to see if there was going to be rebellion. They were afraid that the hostile class that was starving was just going to rebel against the government. What surprised them was kind of a total surprise, was that there were people from the hostile class who were actually not living all that badly. When they checked into those people, what they discovered was they were entrepreneurs. And so the hostile class scratched their head and said, how is this happening? Because we get everything from Kim Jong-il at the time, the father of the current leader of North Korea. How is it that these people are doing so well? They discovered that market system really works, but they had to pay bribes to the security services so they didn't get arrested. And the elites said, many of the elites said, whoa, we could do the same thing too. And Kim Jong-il doesn't usually give us everything we want. So if we became entrepreneurs, we could get the things we wanted to, we could pay for them. And we know the security services guys, we could pay them off. They're our friends. They're not likely to arrest us if we pay them. And so that's what they did. So you have lots of shops and restaurants, 3 million cell phones in North Korea. Most of the shops and restaurants in Pyongyang, where the elites are, because many of those elites are capitalists. They have just amassed great amounts of money. You also have some people who were in the wavering or the lower end of the core class who didn't have the natural access to money, but were just really good businessmen. And these people went out and simply made money. They became merchants. They did trade. They did other things. They made lots of money. And now they are also considered a major force, but they don't have the political clout that the people from the top part of the core class do. These two groups, with their considerable amounts of money, first of all, if you take it away from them, as happened in Iraq, the leadership basically had their money taken away from them. If you do that in North Korea, you shut down the businesses in North Korea, because these are the people who own the businesses. It may sound strange that they own it in a communist system, but the regime has discovered that if we try to shut these markets and other activities down, we destroy the economy. And they've tried many times, experimented with doing so. It's always failed. And so they've allowed these people to get rich. They keep the economy growing, not really fast, but growing. And if you take them down with a unification, you've got a major disaster. So you have to figure out a system to allow them to continue with their businesses, allow them to continue doing the kinds of activities that have made them wealthy, or you've got to bring in massive subsidies to bring others up into that position. But these are the people who are trained. These are the people who know how to market. So if you pull them out of their position, their resources that they have to do it, either they will go ahead and find other resources, probably criminal, probably join the black market and become a really nasty criminal element, or they just won't continue the economy, and you will be years of having a very poor country, much poorer than it is now, which is not in good shape.
So there's a broader economic consideration there as well, this idea of capital flight in a sense. So when Germany, when the wall came down in Germany, East Germany's unemployment rate leapt from effectively 0 to almost 20% overnight. And it's remained or not that high, but it's still 3 times higher than West Germany today. And this is effectively young people and people seeking jobs flee into the most attractive market itself. So is there a way to try and manage this? Because, of course, North Korean elites, as you mentioned, are often the business owners themselves, and they will see the loss of their employers, the loss of trade, and a loss of a lot of their core industry.
Yeah, so if you look at this kind of situation, what you say is, the South Koreans do not want a flood of North Koreans across their border. The North Koreans will find out, if they don't already know, that people in South Korea are immensely better off economically than people in North Korea. So if they feel like they can flood across the border into South Korea, they will destroy the unions. They will essentially take over the lower class jobs. But they'll also take over higher class jobs. There are many scientists, many people with great training in North Korea, and if they are forced into a poverty situation because their resources are taken away from them, you get this massive flood across the border. You won't have housing for those people. You'll have homelessness. You'll have a mess, and the unions don't want that. They're going to fight in the South Korean government to prevent that from happening. What I've argued is probably the best way to handle this is with the property management. When you get a communist country that is suddenly ended and it goes into a capitalist model, someone has to decide what to do with all the property. Now, in reality, North Korea is no longer fully communist. There are, as I said, wealthy North Koreans who own property, but a lot of the property in North Korea is still owned by the government, both housing, farms, and those sorts of things. If these people are told, look, the house that you're living in, the apartment that you're living in, which is essentially like a townhouse, effectively in the ownership mode, if you stay in this for 10 years, it's yours. But if you leave it and you go and flee over to South Korea, you lose it. You've got no rights, and we'll sell it to somebody else. Unless you give these people some incentive not to leave their system, you're going to have a flood of people. Back in the famine again in the late 90s, there was a flood of people into China. We don't know exactly how many because they were illegal and often thrown back into North Korea. But a large number, at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, who fled into China. And that was despite knowing that they would be persecuted in China. In South Korea, the law of South Korea says any North Korean who arrives in South Korea is a South Korean citizen. So the South Koreans don't have a way of telling those people, you can't come in, you're a third-class citizen. They may treat them that way once they're in terms of human-to-human relations. But government-wise, those people are citizens. And they can't really prevent them from coming unless you provide an incentive system for them to stay in the North.
So touching there on this point of privilege here, and moving on to another one of the key aspects that you mentioned in your article. So at the beginning, we talked about Songbun and this idea of the three core castes, and then, of course, 51 subcastes underneath that. You mentioned in your article, and of course this is going to be quite unpleasant for many people in the South to recognize with, but they're going to have to come to the point of realizing that they need to provide some sort of surety to the North Korean elites whose family and themselves are privileged simply because of the birth that they come into. And they're going to have to maintain this for them, or the prospect of reunification is just going to be too unpalatable.
Sure. If you were a government worker in North Korea, say a senior member of one of the ministries, why would you ever agree to a unification if you thought you were going to lose your job, be thrown out on the street, and allowed to starve to death? You know, what choice do you have if that's what's done to you? Well, then you rebel potentially. And not everybody will, but some will. Most all of those people have military training, even if you're in the elites. And in fact, especially if you're in the elites, the likelihood is you've spent some time as a non-commissioned officer or officer in the North Korean military. These are people who, even if they're in their 40s or 50s and haven't been in the military in 10 or 20 or 30 years, they are people with military training who could cause some real problems. And North Korea has some 10,000 underground facilities across the country where military equipment and related things are stored. These people know where at least some of that is. They know where they can go to get the resources, and we're not going to be able to go in and track all that stuff down rapidly. Just not going to have the manpower, even if the population doesn't cause problems. So this is a kind of case where we have to be thinking, we may not like the idea of keeping these people, or the South Koreans may not like the idea of keeping these people in their positions of power, but the alternative could well be much worse. And so you've got two bad alternatives, not a good one, but you got to choose between the two.
And the last of these 5 points that you mentioned that South Koreans and North Korean elite need to consider here is this notion of doing something important with their lives. And you base this on a lot of the testimony of defectors themselves, current defectors, who've come to South Korea and committed their lives to effectively trying to reach out to North Korea to break down the regime, or at least to enlighten certain aspects of the public itself. And you mentioned that beyond all this is often people forget just how important it is to give people a motive and importance in their life, and that of course will be lost when the ideology of the North Korean state breaks down and they are forced into a single unified Korea.
Yeah, especially the senior elites who have defected from North Korea, they all hurt that they no longer have a position of authority and power, which very few of them do in South Korea. Some, but not many. And they would really, really like to contribute to society. So you'll see most of those sending balloons into North Korea with Things like DVDs, USB drives with outside information, socks, electronics. They send them regularly into the North, but also with leaflets, with propaganda on it. Those people are almost all refugees from North Korea, many of them from senior positions who are hurting for not having a valuable role in society. And they take that role by essentially sending information into the North and trying to do what they can to change society in the North. Many of them would like to see the regime come crashing down, but they haven't gotten that far yet, but they work on it.
And one of the barriers in all this, of course, is just how ingrained North Korean elites have become to the idea that unification will be bad for them. It won't work out in their favor. So you speak about this, and this, of course, is a huge challenge for South Korea. That South Korea almost immediately need to begin breaking down these barriers and this long ingrained ideology. They need to start passing laws. They need to start passing policies. They need to effectively start passing taxes and raising money for reunification.
Well, and there's been a resistance in South Korea for doing that. President Lee, who was in office from 2008 to 2013, he tried to pass legislation to start raising such a tax. Immense public opposition to that. So then he tried to pass legislation to simply make a fund where people could contribute towards unification, and that never passed either. The people of South Korea lead a good life, and many of them will ask, why should I pay for these people to live a better life? Won't they just drain my money and not use it responsibly? So there is a problem with trying to fund such things and try to organize it. It's a challenge, and the laws have to change. If the laws say that we're going to apply all South Korean laws to events in North Korea for the last, 70 years, then a lot of the people we've talked about would be arrested, and you wouldn't have a place to put them unless you wanted to put them in the political prison camps that are in North Korea. And even then, they would seriously overflow those. And they would be breeding grounds for rebellion. So you need to create an environment which says, all right, we're going to have so much amnesty. We're going to make so many changes. Now, the current Moon administration, President Moon Jae-in, they're very anxious to move towards peaceful coexistence with the North. And with that, move towards an eventual peaceful unification. Well, let me give you a simple example. There is a group in South Korea that's called the Commission of the Five Provinces, or roughly something like that in Korean. What they have is, for each of the provinces in North Korea, there is a designated governor who is a South Korean who is prepared to take over that province when unification occurs. And he has people who are assigned to take over the mayorship of each of the cities and so forth in North Korea. Well, if you're a North Korean and you're looking at that organization, you're saying, wow, they're going to do me in if I'm a government leader. So the current Moon administration, if they really want to convince the North Koreans that there will be a peaceful unification, they probably need to change the charter of this organization. These people could become the advisors to the governors and mayors in North Korea. They could be working on eventually getting freely elected individuals to those positions. But to put them in and replace all of the leadership in North Korea is going to turn that North Korean leadership against you. So those have got to be things we think through.
And an important challenge in all of this is communicating these policies and these changes to the North Koreans themselves. And of course, this is a very hard country to get any sort of information into. And you mentioned in your piece a couple of times things like radio broadcasts and sending leaflets and balloons and movies and things like this. But of course, North Korea are often quite resistant to these things. Whenever South Korea puts those big speakers up on the DMZ, they get very hostile indeed. And they probably are more likely to see this almost as an act of war itself. Some of these outreach efforts. It's going to be very difficult, sort of tightrope to walk here.
Well, it is a difficult tightrope to work because they consider it to be a hostile act to send that information into the North. Kim Jong-un understands that outside information could do him in and cause the fall of his regime. And so he is absolutely just hard over against this. So you'll remember a month or so ago, a couple months ago, there was a South Korean group that went into the North and put on a concert for Kim Jong-un. And he was there with 1,000 of his best friends. And he loved the music. He went and met some of the entertainers. But if you were a North Korean who wasn't in that auditorium, and you had a CD or a USB drive that had that music on it, and you got caught, you were going to spend 1 to 10 years in prison because of that. So North Korea is not open to outside information. But on the other hand, the North Koreans are regularly interested in the outside. Where they can, they listen to outside radio broadcasts that aren't jammed. They love South Korean soap operas because they show a type of life that the North Koreans will never have. And so there are ways that we could reach the North Koreans, but we have to be fairly careful about it. We know that lots of USBs get into North Korea with soap operas. Why aren't we putting commercials on those soap operas that explain that here's the way that unification would be done? You know, you're not going to lose your job. You're not going to have your wealth stolen from you. But you have to have the policies first, and then you can communicate those things.
And an important part of this, you mentioned in your piece a couple of times, is bringing across not just the military, but of course this core class of generals, this very small elite few people. And just what you mentioned there, there's this chance of miscalculation in all of this, or there's this chance that some of the generals will resist and form into some sort of rogue element inside North Korea. And you're a bit of an expert yourself on the missile technology as well. So just imagine, just give a brief picture here on what it might look like if this does go badly, because of course you may have the North Korean generals effectively embedding themselves and having an Iraq type insurgency. But there's also the possibility they have access to large infrastructure. They may have access to missile launchers themselves. And of course, if a city like Seoul is targeted, it's going to be pretty catastrophic.
Well, exactly. So back in 1993, there was the first nuclear crisis in North Korea. This was when the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, had discovered that North Korea was enriching uranium contrary to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so there were actions being taken to stop the North Korean violations. And at that time, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, the grandfather of the current leader, called together his senior military. And he told them, he said, look, we may have to fight the Americans over our nuclear program. If we do, can we win? And they said, yeah, we'll win. Because, of course, if they didn't, they were in trouble. But then he threw them a curve and he said, but if we lose, what do we do? Now, the military guys were all smart enough to know that was a great time to keep their mouths shut. But Kim Jong-il, his son, the father of the current leader, said, if we lose, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? Now, any kind of unification that is a unification not controlled by North Korea is a loss of this type. So you can expect that even if Kim Jong-un were dead, some of his military would gain control of missile systems and other means of causing damage. So we have to gain some understanding here. You know, he said, if we lose, I will be sure to destroy the earth. Well, can he destroy the earth? Not really. And he can't really do that much with rifles and tanks because much of his stuff is outdated and not very effective. But his missiles are a worry, especially if they've got nuclear weapons on them. And note that he also said the Earth. He didn't say South Korea. So the Chinese know that his people will be potentially targeting China, especially if China crosses the border in North Korea to try to stabilize things, which they appear to be preparing to do. He'll target South Korea, potentially Japan and Russia, and if he gets ICBMs, the United States. How much damage could he do? Well, North Korea has done 6 nuclear tests. The first through the 5th nuclear tests were somewhere in the range of a 1 kiloton weapon. That means 1,000 tons of TNT, to a roughly 15 or so kiloton weapon, roughly the size of the Hiroshima weapon that was used against Hiroshima. Those weapons detonated in Seoul, something around, say, 10 kilotons, would cause somewhere around 350,000 deaths and serious injury. Okay, so those kind of weapons can cause somewhere between or somewhere around 300,000 deaths and serious injuries if detonated in Seoul or detonated in Busan or some of the other large cities. But in the 6th nuclear test, North Korea's weapon was a 250 kiloton weapon. That weapon detonated in Seoul would kill or seriously injure somewhere around 3.5 million people. One weapon. We can't let that happen. That's why President Trump is so hard over about eliminating the North Korean nuclear weapons. He wants to dismantle that system because of the severe damage that they could do. So this is the kind of case where we really have to try to make sure that as many of the generals as possible think they're getting a pretty good deal so that we don't face this kind of effort to cause damage, whether it's with nuclear weapons. North Korea has lots of chemical and biological weapons. And they also have special forces that could go into South Korea and create criminal families and cause major damage. We've really got to try to avoid them wanting to go into destructive kinds of actions.
So we've kind of walked into it a little bit already there. But of course, one of the important things to mention during some of this is the 2 scenarios for what unification will look like. And we'll come to peaceful unification in just a second here. But the first one that we've just walked into there is reunification by conflict. So just give us an idea of what that would look like. How plausible would this be, and how reasonable would an actual reunification of this violent kind actually be for the Korean Peninsula? Because, of course, you just mentioned there that China would probably likely intervene, America would be intervening, there would be all sorts of weapons going back and forth, and all sorts of deeper challenges here.
Certainly. Yeah, so to start off with, the North Korean leaders, the Kim family, have for decades said one of their objectives is unification of the country under North Korean control. Well, they can't do that, economically or anything like that. What historically we've worried about is that they would try to do that militarily, that they would invade South Korea, try to destroy the South Korean military, and gain control of the South. That is part of the reason why there is a U.S.-South Korea alliance. We have American troops in South Korea, about 30,000. They would be the leading edge of the U.S. defense, but they're there in South Korea to make sure we could send many, many more to South Korea in a smooth manner under a combined structure where the Americans and the South Koreans could fight effectively against North Korea. That situation has existed for decades. It will exist until there's some form of real and lasting peace in North Korea. So if that kind of war started, North Korea could invade the South. The South Korean defenses in the forward area are fairly stout, so North Korea would likely use chemical weapons on their artillery to barrage that area. North Korean chemical weapons, we believe, run about 2,500 to 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. Now, you'll remember that back in February last year, Kim Jong-un arranged to have his older brother killed down in an airport in Malaysia. He was killed by women spreading a chemical weapon on his cheeks. Roughly speaking, the quantity of chemical weapon they spread on his cheek was about 1/10 of a drop. That was all it took to kill him. And North Korea has tons of this stuff. In fact, not just tons, it has thousands of tons of chemical weapons. So if they start barraging the forward area's defenses, the North Korean city of Seoul has grown up into those forward areas. There will be immense civilian casualties. So even if all North Korea does is start firing an artillery barrage, pretty quickly the South Korean military is going to conclude that they have to go into North Korea to clean that artillery out. And once they do, they're not going to let a South Korean regime continue to exist, which has killed hundreds of thousands of South Koreans, probably with weapons of mass destruction. It's just not going to happen. So they are going to want to destroy the North Korean military. They're going to want to take down the regime in North Korea and unify under South Korean control. But remembering that Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, told his father that he would be sure to destroy the earth in that kind of situation, North Korea will hold some kind of strategic reserve of nuclear weapons. And when you get to this point in a conflict, they will likely fire them, probably at most of their neighbors and not just at South Korea, causing immense damage in the neighboring areas. You could literally have millions and millions of people killed by North Korea in such acts. Now, once that's happened, I mean, from an American perspective, remember the end of World War II. How did Americans feel about Germans? We didn't feel too good about them. And that was nothing like what would be done by North Korea. The attitude towards the North Koreans, whether or not the people were responsible for the damage of the war, will probably be highly hostile. And so getting any kind of peaceful unification out of it, almost impossible. The South will go in and likely impose the control, which isn't going to lead to a peaceful mode of unification, just out of retribution in part because of all the damage that's been done, and it'll really be difficult. That's the wartime scenario.
So let's move on to the peaceful scenario there, and that same prospect that you just had there, because this for many doesn't sound very good for Kim Jong-un either. So the idea of a peaceful scenario would still presumably involve the fall of Kim's regime. So whether it's through just an entire collapse of the government itself or being usurped by someone else, it's hard to imagine Kim Jong-un and his family remain in any capacity, even with a peaceful reunification.
Exactly. So Kim Jong-un has very strong feelings about imposing control on South Korea, not allowing the South Koreans to have any kind of control in the north, not sharing control of the country. So it's very hard to imagine. Really, right at this stage, it's hard to imagine him giving up his nuclear weapons even. I mean, yeah, he said he's prepared to give up his nuclear weapons, but he just wrote a letter last Friday after President Trump's letter where he told his foreign ministry and the top leadership of his party that they should endeavor to continue to sustain the North Korean nuclear power and to force the Americans into surrendering. So it's a little hard to believe him when he says things like that. My sense is there will have to be a fall of the regime. Now, that is not going to be caused by outside. If the outside did it, you're now into the war scenario. This scenario would be a case where the leadership of North Korea, has him killed. He likes to fly, so maybe he goes up in his Cessna and it doesn't come back. We don't know how it would happen. But in my discussions with very senior North Korean defectors, they argue that in such a case, there's no logical successor in his family. So the likelihood is a group of senior elites in North Korea would get together. They would decide who the new leader is without announcing the death of Kim Jong-un. And then once they decided who was going to take over, they would announce his death and they would announce who the new leader is. Now, that new leader is not going to be from the Kim family. To establish legitimacy, he's going to have to make changes in the North. More than likely, he will be one of the senior elites who's been a capitalist, because he'll have the money to pay off the others and to guarantee his position. That means that North Korea probably would adjust in the direction of a Chinese capitalist system. It's kind of a hybrid between capitalism and socialism, communism, but it would move in that direction, and that would make a unification easier over time. Probably still take 10 to 20 years, but I think that becomes a possibility in that kind of situation without the Kim family around.
So let's follow that on a bit here, because of course this is so prescient right now, simply based on the summits and the talks of denuclearization. But of course, impactful through all of that is this constant stream of reunification. So I heard you mention once here that people need to be a little bit careful about talking to North Korea, and you mentioned Hitler and Neville Chamberlain, and you mentioned that Chamberlain didn't realize that when he was negotiating with Hitler, that Hitler wasn't actually just negotiating. He was using negotiations as an element of war. And exactly. Do you see that in any way here, or how do you see this current hype over summits and discussions?
Well, so let's transition from December last year. In December last year, I think most people in South Korea would have considered Kim Jong-un an enemy, that he had been firing missiles and testing nuclear weapons, and people were pretty worn down by it and pretty scared. They considered him an enemy. He then, on January 1st, does his New Year's Day address, which is his State of the Union. That is done each year. And he talks about unification a dozen times. He uses the word a dozen times. He doesn't mean a South Korean-style unification. He means unification under his authority. So how does he get there? Well, okay, so the next thing he does is he talks with the South Koreans about coming to the Olympics as a unified Korean team. And the people in South Korea love it. They see his cheerleaders who come, they see his people, and the tension is reduced. Things look better. And then he says, well, I'm ready to give up my nuclear weapons, and I want to have a summit meeting with President Moon and then with President Trump. And all of this looks to many people very good. By the beginning of May this year, one of the polls in South Korea indicated that 77% of South Koreans thought he was a reliable person with whom to work and that they could work out the long term of Korea with him. How do you ever get that kind of immense political turnover in 4 months? And yet he did it. He did an amazing job of psychological operations, which is to say subversion of the South Korean people. And now the question is, as you listen to what he says and what he's trying to do, he almost sounds like he's running for president of South Korea in 2022. Now that's extreme. He's not going to do that. But what would happen if North Korea and South Korea set up a confederation, which has always been the South Korean plan, and they set up a board of rulers for the Confederation of 3 North Koreans and 3 South Koreans. Kim Jong-un would control the 3 North Koreans, and he would have some serious influence on at least 1 or 2 of the South Koreans. He would potentially be in control. So in the short term, Confederation in that kind of way is not something that makes sense for the South Koreans. We have to worry what his ultimate objective is. Is he really being truthful when at one point he says he's willing to give up nuclear weapons, and then he tells his elites that he's really not, he wants to sustain them? Where he told Secretary of State, our Secretary of State, that he was going to send an advance team to Singapore 2 weeks ago to set up the June 12th summit meeting, and he didn't do it. And the U.S. team sat in Singapore for 3 days. They got no notice from North Korea that they weren't going to show up. They tried to call North Korea and find out what was going on and could get no response.
It appears like they've also been selling to their own people the idea that it's America who's been doing the outreach and America that wants the summits. And of course, this is just not correct.
It is a lie. And then Kim Jong-un told Secretary of State Pompeo, he said, look, when we take apart our Punggye-ri nuclear test facility, we will allow American technical experts to be there to verify that we did it. And then they reneged. Now, I'm sorry, if he's saying he's going to give up his nuclear weapons, but as part of that, he's taking apart his nuclear test facility, and he promises to have technical experts there for verification and then reneges, how can I count on him? More generally, how do I count on the North Koreans? Because they've agreed on multiple agreements to not ever have nuclear weapons, to give them up, and they violated almost every agreement that they've ever made. If you look at the April 27th agreement between President Moon and Kim Jong-un in the summit meeting they held, item 3.4 says, we will denuclearize the peninsula to the point where there are no nuclear capabilities on the peninsula. Okay, so why did the North Korean first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs say 2 weeks ago that complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of their nuclear weapons was not possible and would not agree to that? Because 0 sounds like complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement. Moreover, in 1992, North Korea and South Korea signed a declaration where they said neither side would have nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon production capability, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing. And yet North Korea has been in violation of that. It was at the time it made the agreement. It has been ever since. And you might say, well, okay, you know, they made some mistakes. We could go back and fix this. But in the April 27th agreement, item 1.1 is North and South Korea will fully implement all agreements and declarations previously entered into. Well, the 1992 agreement is one they entered into. They need to turn off their uranium enrichment. They need to turn off their plutonium reprocessing. They need to stop nuclear weapon production. And they need to give up their nuclear weapons. They've agreed to it, but they're not doing it.
So do you think the safe thing to take from all this is that effectively North Korea are just not serious about giving up their nuclear weapons? That this is some kind of deeper power play where they may be trying to separate America from South Korea, to maybe play the public towards the idea that that North Korea want peaceful unification and denuclearization, so does South Korea. But if it's the Americans and maybe a belligerent president that's causing all the problems, and that is one more step towards a potential unification by force, by absorption, that they can free the peninsula of Americans and their attachment there, and then you have an easier target in South Korea.
Oh, absolutely. That's the kind of policy that North Korea has pursued for decades. Kim Jong-un on multiple occasions has asked for a peace treaty. Why does he want a peace treaty? Well, since that discussion began in roughly March this year, the media have been saying, oh, well, if we have a peace treaty, we no longer need American troops in South Korea. So we ought to get ready to pull them out of South Korea because peace treaty is going to happen right away within the next months or certainly couple years. That fails to take into account what the purposes of American forces are in Korea. A peace treaty with North Korea, which has reneged on many elements of their previous treaties, is not very meaningful until they prove that they really have peaceful intent. That will take years, and until that's done, you better not pull American troops out. Because if you do, guess what? The South Koreans are going to say, wait a minute, the American nuclear umbrella, which we think is protecting us against this North Korea, which is still removing its nuclear weapons, it's no longer very effective if there are no Americans at risk here. So we probably need our own nuclear weapons. Do we really want that kind of outcome?
So, on that pessimistic point, it might be a good place to just to leave this off here. So the article that we've been speaking through here is called "Preparing North Korean Elites for Unification." It's available on the RAND website. I'll put the link below this podcast, along with a link to Bruce Bennett's page itself. So, Bruce Bennett, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Happy to do it. Thank you.